this conversation, and I should begin by saying that I'm a philosopher, so I've got a particular angle on this question that comes from taking quite seriously the idea that Europe is in an existential crisis. This is how it's been described by several people, and just anecdotally, when I mentioned that I was coming to speak here, two friends independently said to me they felt that Brexit had stolen an aspect of their identity. It had literally stolen something from them that they didn't want taken away. I mean, one is a woman who sees herself primarily as a Londoner and as a European, and for her being British or English was not particularly significant, but her identity as a European seemed to be something that was under existential threat. Just for clarity, as an executive summary of what I'm going to say, the question is, do Europeans exist? And my answer is yes, but we'll have to choose what that means. Okay, so it's clear that each of us has many potential identities, not just one. We're not just one thing. Some of these identities overlap, some are discrete, and many of them are actually compatible without contradiction. It's not either or, but usually both and. So that at one level, I personally choose to be with Diogenes the Cynic, a citizen of no state. I'm a citizen of the world, the cosmos. I'm a cosmopolitan, and I believe that. And that's not a given, that's not a fact that you just read off from my humanity. It's not something we discover, it's not something a paleontologist could discover. You don't get it by looking at my DNA. It's a choice. And nobody can take that away from me, no referendum or any political act. Though I do acknowledge that my passport is never going to read Nigel Warburton, citizen of the world. But I'm still a cosmopolitan, whatever the bureaucrats choose to say about me. But at the same time, I'm a philosopher. That's not incompatible. I'm a writer. I'm a freelance writer. I have red hair. I'm left-handed. That's why I can't operate this. Any clue? What do I do to make the next slide? Oh, click. Okay. Thank you. It's completely. It's the right-handed world that we're living in. I'm left-handed. I'm from Bexley. I'm English. I'm British. I'm white. I'm middle-aged. And yes, I'm also European. But it depends on the context as whether which of those I emphasise. And there are many other features that I could emphasise in my self-image. And I can vary the nuance of this. It's my self-portrait. I create my self-portrait through the different emphases I give. So I can be cosmopolitan in spirit, but European by choice. I can also choose, or I could have chosen, like some of my compatriots, to have been anti-cosmopolitan, to be English through and through, and to have no emotional ties whatsoever with Europe. I might say, personally, that that's narrow-minded and insular, but that's still a choice. So nevertheless, at a football match, I might be English through and through, because I want my side to win. So these different identities overlap, compete sometimes, but are often compatible without contradiction. And it's a matter of the choices that I make for myself, and that's how I shape what I am. I take quite seriously Heracles, the 2nd century Stoic philosopher, who put this in terms of concentric circles. The human predicament is the predicament of the person at the centre of the concentric circle, the self, the individual, who has a close network of friends and a broader network of community. Then there is the state, or could it be broader than the state? It could be a conglomeration of states. And then there is humanity, the whole of humanity. And actually, there could be a bigger circle for many of us, which takes in all sentient beings. And some people would want even a larger circle than that, which would take in the complete biosphere, the complete animals, the set of animals and plants, or beyond that, everything that is. I don't think you can go larger than that. So the question for most individuals is how, as a self, I relate to these circles. Do I try, as a cosmopolitan would, to bring in humanity, to be concerned with the broadest sense of what it is to be human, or do I get local and perhaps parochial and focus on my family and friends and my local community? Do I lock down on just those people who are close to me physically and emotionally and a bit like me and share my values? Heracles thought that we should aim to bring in the outer circle to recognise that we are human beings and we have, as many people do in relation to the refugee crisis, for instance, responsibilities and possibilities of helping people who aren't part of our smaller community, and that these are part of the area of concern for us. So we choose our self-identity, this is what I would say, and we shift our emphases over the course of a day. I'll have many identities possibly during the course of this lecture, certainly over the course of the day, depending on the context. And I'm quite struck by what the social psychologist Irving Goffman said about this. He gave what he called a dramaturgical account of human interaction. Dramaturgical in the sense that he took seriously the idea that we are actors, we are presenting images, presenting a vision, a mask to other people. And the mask that we present is, to some degree, ourself, or the set of masks that we present, and there is no true self behind that. We are just a series of performances that we give as actors to other people. But we manipulate those masks, those performances very carefully, and in choosing our identity, that is actually a way of presenting ourselves, staging our lives to other people. There's no true self behind it that you discover by doing the biological test that you're really European. There's no true test that discovers you're really British through and through. There's a sense in which you perform Britishness or you perform being European. But there are limits on what I can choose to be. Some people think there aren't, but I couldn't self-identify as a piece of granite, a piece of stone. That would be ridiculous. But I have a very wide repertoire of identities to draw upon. And I want to try and say a little bit about how we might collectively sculpt the identity of being European. I don't think there's a given that you can read off from the history of Europe about what it is to be European. There may be, enshrined in law, as we've heard, certain attempts to fix what it is to be European within the EU, but Europe is larger. Is this too risky to say this? Europe is larger than the EU. There is more to being European than simply being within a legal framework provided by the European Union. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about something that I want you to take seriously, the idea that we could focus on certain core values of being European and choose these as values. These are put forward with a view to argue and debate these. I'm not saying this is the definitive list of values, but it seems to me these are values which are in the history of Europe, which are values worth having. And I think what I'm suggesting we're doing is, in the process of looking at these values, that we are doing much as the philosopher R.G. Collingwood said we do when we create a work of art. So for Collingwood, a work of art is essentially an idea, an emotion it begins with, what he called an inchoate emotion, one that's not fully formed. You have a sense of it. You have this thing pressing on you that you feel, you know not what it is. You can't really get it clear, but we know we've got a sense of being European. You've got a sense that it's important. And for Collingwood, the creation of a work of art is an unfinished, it's never finished, the process, but it's a process of often making material and working with material to explore possibilities that clarify to other people precisely what you meant by that very unformed emotion, to bring it into consciousness. So I think it's true that many of us have a positive association with Europe, but it's not quite in focus. And the act of zooming in on particular sets of values could help clarify that, even if it's a process of rejecting those values and replacing them with others. So I'm going to run past you some of my putative values. So, for me, the starting point of European identity is that to be European is to be civilized. This is about a set of norms, a set of patterns of ways of behaving that are the best of being European, that it's not just in terms of politeness, it's a set of to be focused patterns of interaction between individuals that shows mutual respect and draws on a long history of cultural development within Europe. To be European is to be educated. We are, compared with many parts of the world, very highly educated. And we have a passion for education. This seems to be one of the great values of Europe, that we emphasize the value of European education for our children. It is part of the acculturation process that we're educated in, not just the practicalities of life, but in our culture, but also in science, not necessarily as practitioners, but as people who can understand the scientific developments that have given us the possibility of travel, of harnessing energy, of interaction with other people at a distance. More traditionally, we are tolerant, and this is controversial in this context, but I believe there is a very fine strain of toleration within Europe that, as a philosopher, I would look at John Locke, for instance, the English philosopher, his emphasis on the need to have religious toleration, though oddly he didn't tolerate Catholics because they were enthralled to a foreign power, and he didn't tolerate atheists, which was unfortunate as well, because he thought they couldn't be trusted because they didn't have a holy book to swear on. But he advocated religious toleration on the grounds that freedom of belief is something that you can't actually change even by torture. You can't change somebody's beliefs. You can't guarantee that you change their beliefs. And it's incredibly destructive and ultimately un-Christian to try and do it anyway. Perhaps in a more modern vein, Pierre Bayle was advocating toleration of different religions, toleration of different ways of living, up to the point where toleration risks violence and harm. And Voltaire, John Stuart Mill, there's a great philosophical tradition of arguing about the value of tolerating people with whom we disagree strongly, and that is partly why free speech is a core aspect of the value of toleration. I mean, other reasons for that might be to do with the progress of science, to do with the progress of social development, allowing the possibility of criticism, even if with the criticism that you least want to hear. I think that there's a great democratic tradition within Europe, despite the presence of Belarus and some other countries in Europe. There is a tradition of democracy, and it's a fine tradition of representative democracy. We've seen the dangers of direct democracy in Britain, something that Plato foresaw long ago. If you want to decide what happens when the captain of a ship falls overboard, you don't vote on which way to turn the rudder. You ask if there's a competent pilot in the room. On board. If you find yourself on board an aircraft and both pilots fall asleep or fall unconscious, you don't take a vote on which button to press. You see if anybody else is competent to fly the plane. But there is a great tradition of representative democracy, which is a fine tradition of using voting as a method of removing people who prove themselves inadequate to the task. There's a tradition of being just, a fantastic tradition of being just, the rule of law and the possibility of coming back and questioning a decision that has been made locally and have it reviewed at a higher level within the framework of human rights. Controversially, I believe there's a great tradition of cosmopolitanism, of having wider concerns than the merely European. We care about what happens to people beyond the borders of Europe. We don't want people to starve in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't want people to drown off the coast of Syria, in the sea off Italy. We don't want children to be left hungry in any part of the world. That is part of what it is to be European, not to have the small interests of just the people closest to us. And lastly, I think, and importantly, we are free and we value freedom. This is freedom of movement, freedom of trade, but it's also freedom of thought, it's freedom of expression, it's the sense of having autonomy over our lives as individuals, the great liberal tradition of having space to perform what John Stuart Mill called experiments of living. to try out different ways of living without, whether those are sexual different ways of living or different ways of building, different ways of finding our own place in the world. We're allowed to make our own mistakes, not having a one-size life imposed on us from without by those with religious or political views about how we should live. So there's space to be free within the framework that respects the need to draw a limit at the point where you harm other people by your actions. That is a great European tradition. And so for me, there is the possibility of a conversation about these kinds of values. Sartre famously declared that we are thrown into the world and we're alone without excuse in a world without pre-existing values. I want to say that we're actually together without excuse in a world of many competing values. There are pre-existing values. We have to decide between them. We have to choose from amongst the portfolio of possible values. We don't choose the fascism. We don't choose the xenophobia. If we want to identify what it is to be European, we have a conversation about this, an intelligent conversation, and focus what is at the moment, for many, and many of my compatriots, an inchoate idea with many false pictures of what is of value in Europe. Going back to Sartre, he famously said after the Second World War that we never felt freer, we French never felt freer than under the occupation by Germany. Paradoxically, freedom was in every action that we performed then. And I want to say that I've never felt more European than since Brexit. And I want this conversation to continue, and I want to choose to be European. Thank you.